There you go. She's nice. She wants us to compare the recordings in progress. Okay, right. Let me. Okay, serious. Hannah. Okay.
It was awful. Every time I heard myself, I thought I sounded terrible. Every time I hear it, it's like I feel like I'm failing constantly.
Hello and welcome to One Cool Thing, a podcast from indie game studio Digue de Fabrique, hosted by me, Hannah Nicklin. If you've been enjoying these podcasts, please do check out our newly announced title, Saltsea Chronicles, at saltseachronicles.com, and Wishlist is on Steam. Go on, do it now. Go on, do it now. Now, please. Thank you. Okay. One Cool Thing is a podcast speaking with people in and around video games about one cool thing not from games, which is really fascinating them right now. I'll introduce them and their practice, talk about the one cool thing they brought to the conversation, and consider how it's shaping how they think about their work. It's a chance to hear more about the practices of cool folks working in games, and hopefully somewhere where we can all reflect on how we think about how we make things. So, without further ado, let's meet our next guest. Lisy Kane is a Melbourne-based video game producer and co-founder of Girl Geek Academy, a super cool social enterprise set up to achieve trans and non-binary inclusive gender equality in the tech industry. They've recently produced an extremely good and strongly worded, well-evidenced report called Enough Talk, which focuses on solutions that fix the system, not the girls. You can find that on girlgeekacademy.com alongside the workshops and classes they organize for gender marginalized folks interested in tech and games. As a producer, Lisy made a huge impact as production director at League of Geeks, who most recently released Armello in 2019, and also recently announced Jump Light Odyssey, which looks super cool. She's since moved on to running production initiatives for Kelper Interactive, which is the sort of publishing arm of Kowloon Knights, who you might have heard of. And I'm super stoked to welcome someone from the production and publishing side of the video games field, as I'm someone who believes that how we make deeply affects what we make and how sustainable that making is. A crucial part of game design is the design of your processes, which is where producers come in. Shout out to the producers. Lisy, welcome. How do you feel about that intro? Is there anything that you want to add, amend?
I gotta pay you to follow me around and introduce me.
I will be your hype woman.
That was great.
On board.
That was very, very good. Thank you so much. That was great.
So I am here to ask you what one cool thing you brought in for us to consider today.
I feel like this is something that it comes up every so often in my life, but it always comes back to this. And the one cool thing is playing in a band.
Though I felt my faith in this place disappear, my view of the rest of the world stayed clear, and for now I'll take solace in calling to mind a singular life prior to this double bind. Hand on my heart,
I'm so excited to share this conversation with you. Just to share with the listeners, I used to have a very rich, and before I took over running a game company, which takes all my time, I had a very rich music life. I ran a record label. I was in a band myself. I was very active in the math rock scene and the emo scene in Scotland and England in particular, although I have a lot of soft spot for my Italian amici who are all, in the sort of emo scene in Milan, which is also very anti-fascist. Anyway, however, we are here to talk about you, Lisy. I just want the context for the excitement to be offered to the listeners there. So, Lisy, tell us about, was it one band? Was it several bands that you were in? Tell us about your being in a band.
We won't talk about all the bands, but no. I have played in, before I got into the games industry, music was definitely the thing that I thought was my life, essentially, from a creative perspective. I had played music from a very, very young age. So from the age of 5, I was a classically trained violinist. And getting into high school, you talk about rebellion. That's, one of my forms of rebellion was, figuring out that you could also play guitar as well as play violin. And we started playing cover bands in high school, a lot of Dashboard Confessional, Blink-182 kind of style cover bands. But, it really started in that early stage. But when I got into my early 20s, late teens, that's when I found, through MySpace, I will say, the band that I ended up playing with for I think it was about 8 years by the end of it. And it was something that was very, very formative to just obviously my creative life, but also just how I kind of, framed my own way of working today, how I interact with people, and a lot of things that I learn now was actually from that time. I definitely auditioned for bands and didn't get in. And then I did a little session recording. That was kind of the thing that I thought I was going to turn into more of a career, was the session recording. I think my last claim to fame was playing on the same stage. I was brought in last minute to play violin for a band that was supporting Beach House. So I got to play on the same stage as Beach House, and that was kind of my last foray in performance, but I miss it. I miss it a lot.
Sure. And so this band, are you talking about your the post-punk 5-piece Epithets?
Yes. That is why it's the one cool thing, I think, as well, is there's a lot of overlaps between what I do today and what I did back then. That group was, five ragtag people that kind of came together with a unique kind of like for a certain genre of music. We rallied around the lead singer and writer, Nick. But we all had we're in our early 20s, right? It's a time in your life that there's a lot of stuff going on, and it was an outlet, but also a curse for us in a lot of different ways. It was a really challenging experience, but yeah, it was super fun.
I memorized my lines so well, repeated them so often, I think I started to believe.
So I had the absolute pleasure of giving Epithets a bit of a listen on Bandcamp before chatting. I guess so I should start from the very beginning in terms of just introducing the listeners. What is post-punk is probably a useful place to start. It's essentially sort of gentler and more experimental punk, right?
Yeah. So you've got your, emo and your Fugazi and all that kind of stuff that kind of came up through the late 90s and early 2000s. And the response to that afterwards came, the softer side and the still very poetic, still very sad, very complicated music. Our drummer, Simon, was actually from another band in Brisbane called To the North. I think they were really punk. So he only played with, a 3-piece drum set. Absolutely has smashed his lower back in because of how hard he plays the drums. But then coupled with violin, coupled with a really, really sad 20-something young man in Brisbane singing about his experiences and using very, very long words. That was kind of the summation of the band. We were very sloppy. Our recordings were always bad. Everything was kind of very DIY, but that's part of the whole, that genre of music as well, is the struggle.
Repeat the list of all I have done, as though it's a contest I might have won.
So, for the listeners, post-punk has this sort of kind of, churn over the decades, and that there's the Joy Division and Talking Heads post-punk, and then there's the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and the Block Party post-punk, and then in sort of the time when both you and I were in our mid-20s, there was another, and it's really interesting to me, I think, that all of these things, punk, indie, DIY, they're all labels which are both aesthetics and modes of production, right?
Yeah,
and by the time we were making this stuff, it was DIY was the term that you used, right? And it meant that there wasn't big money behind you, but it was also a way of working together. I wonder if you have any thoughts on DIY as a mode of production.
Oh my God, I love this so much. So I grew up in Brisbane. So Brisbane is a small city in comparison to Melbourne and Sydney in Australia. And when I was growing up in the, 2000s to 2010s, not many bands would ever come to Brisbane. It was too expensive. It's really hard to get bands to come all the way to Australia. So for a long time, there were no bands. So what ended up happening in Brisbane, there was a very, very rich underground music scene because of that. People would put on gigs at, I've thrown gigs at, churches, town halls, all this type of stuff. We did it from a very young age. I was putting on gigs at 15, putting together flyers and just getting your local friends' bands to play there. Nick as well, our lead singer and songwriter, he used to run a festival in Brisbane called No Culture. And that was also a response to the idea of Brisbane, not having any music, not having any art scenes around us, and actually putting on bands and bringing bands out just to play in, once again, living rooms. Some of the best shows that I've played and seen at were in like living rooms of Queensland houses.
Absolutely. And there was like a party house in London I went to a bunch, and it was just the house where the gigs happened, It's really, really amazing. We even at one stage, Nick brought out an artist called Jens Lekman, who was like, I think he's still popping around these days, but, folkish artist. He played in like a basement of our friend's house. And he's like, the next night he was playing like a stage in Brisbane, but people like that, artists like that do gravitate towards it. And it's something that was very, very special about Brisbane. And it's still to this day has a very rich music scene because of that DIY-ness of everything. We had friends that would run, band rooms. We had friends that ran recording studios, and you just all knew each other and supported each other within that community. It was very, very, very special time, I think, in Brisbane that has kind of we'll obviously never go back to that because we now have the internet. We still had MySpace back then, so it wasn't as easy to share music, and it was a bit more about that local community, but it was a very, very, very awesome time to be a creative person at that time. For sure. And so you sort of talked a little bit there about how it was very much about Brisbane as well. Like Brisbane were the material conditions from which the practice emerged. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how Brisbane was sort of a part of the forming of the band and the scene and your experience there.
Oh God, so I feel like this is going to be a therapy session for me. So Brisbane, another great piece of work, there's a book called All My Friends Are Leaving Brisbane. And it kind of sums up what it's like to be in your early 20s and finishing high school in Brisbane. The expectations, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this that grow up in small towns. The expectation is either you stay in Brisbane, you live in Brisbane, and you just die there. That's one thing. You have your wife, kids, like all that type of thing, very traditional upbringing. And then the other is you just leave immediately as soon as you can. And that's what happens a lot. People in droves will move to London, overseas, Melbourne, Sydney, as soon as they hit 18 or finish university. So it leaves the city to be it feels like a cage in a way a lot of the time. You need to stay there because you've got your family and your university, but you know that you want to get out of there as soon as you can. And music is obviously a way to have that connection. And a lot of the stuff we sung about and a lot of the stuff we talked about as artists was around that feeling of being trapped and feeling that, the dramas of living in a small town as well feels very heavy and a lot more real than potentially if you were living in a bigger city as well. So, there's that classic thing. If you meet someone from Brisbane, you can actually connect at least 2 or 3 friends that you've got mutual friends. It's almost like a badge of honor in a way, but it's still also a curse. So it's this kind of constant struggle between those two things around, do I actually like it? And I still say to this day, I would never move back there. I couldn't live there. It still feels a little too suffocating, but it is also very beautiful. And I also understand why people do stay there and live there. And it's that constant battle, and it still happens. And it's a very, very interesting place.
Of course it crossed my mind. What else could I be doing with whatever time remains? As we retrace our steps, for lack of better pastimes through the endless autumn rain.
so we've got sort of the material conditions of the band, and we've got the scene of the band, and then let's sort of zoom in to epithets and how you make music. So like for those who, you know, I'm not sure if our producer's going to sprinkle some little samples in, but I would describe it as kind of like you know, quite minimalist. That you've described it as kind of chill. There's like a Low and Dirty 3 EP called In the Fish Tank, which it absolutely made me like think of. Low is one act, Dirty 3 or another act. It was like a kind of an EP they worked on together. But yeah, so, and there's like super contemplative like lyrics and also pacing. Like it was quite gentle to listen to. Like, was that sound led by, you sort of mentioned a lead writer and singer, or was it something that you all sort of discovered together?
Yeah, so generally speaking, interesting enough, I talked to a few people about this. I do have a tattoo on my arm, actually, which is of a house in Toowoomba, which is about 2 hours outside of Brisbane. It's a farm kind of region. It was the place that we actually wrote our last album together. We all went in knowing that was going to be the case. And we decided to, I don't know why, but we decided to lock ourselves in a unair-conditioned house in the middle of summer to write this album together. And we'd kind of taken all of our previous experiences of how we liked writing music and did that. Essentially, like our approach would usually be Nick, the lead singer and guitarist, would usually come to us with some kind of framework, either, you know, some very verbose lyrics or, you know, a small little jangly, you know, classic Smeth. We call him Smethurst. That's always our running joke because that's his surname. So Smethurst would bring in like some kind of guitar piece or riff, and then we'd usually start to layer on top of that. Or sometimes our bassist Dwayne would come in with a bass line, because his approach to bass was quite different in the sense that it wasn't just an anchor. It was actually quite melodic, and you know, he also played a lot of shoegaze on his own solo projects, so he was used to also being the front person of his own act as well. So he would normally bring things in. I was definitely, my approach to it, because of the nature of violin, I always stood back. I definitely wanted to feel and experience the music in its entire form before I felt I could actually start to add in, because often, and the struggle with recording violin too is unfortunately a lot of, I would say none of the recordings we've done I'm actually happy with, because I don't think recording DIY violin is not something that can be done. But, you know, I'd always wait for the moment to figure out how I could add another element, a tone to it. But then also, it was also probably because I was insecure as well. I was, you know, in my early 20s still, I still didn't really have the confidence as a musician to feel that I could compare myself to someone like Nick and bring in something completely unique. So I always kind of stepped back and just added things in after the fact. Towards the end, I definitely got a lot more confident and would be writing as we went. But generally speaking, I would much prefer to be an observer and then add things in. The drums were always something that I wanted to kind of like compete against, because I always found that interesting. I still think Simon is one of the best drummers I've ever worked with. He's very, very, very good at what he does, but he kind of does it with his full self. Mm-hmm. So sometimes he doesn't even realize how great what he writes is as well. And so that's usually who I would riff off the most, would be that drum beat as well. And this would obviously go for days on end. So we spent about 7 days writing that album together. And it was incredibly challenging, but really, really, really formative in a lot of and it was very cathartic, because we knew it was the end, quote unquote, the end. So yeah, that's a kind of high level, especially for that practice. I obviously still dabble in my own music, which is a whole different thing, but that's that's how I always liked working with bands, as I like being the, you know, the jazz on top of everything kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah. And just a tiny observation that I also make about my own life is that I've just hopped from one like white male dominated industry to another. Like and like that's got to be some part
Oh
of
my
like,
goodness.
like finding confidence in another space where white men love to explain things to you, and then like it really equipped me for games, quite honestly. Like I was able to see the bullshit a mile off. I don't know about you.
Well, honestly, this is why that's why I think it's important to talk about this particular subject, because 100%, I got my battle armor from playing in pubs in Australia, where constantly sound guys would be like, couldn't figure out how to set mic up a electric violin. Like, and it is hard, but I would be able to do it if they let me do it. and you know, a violin obviously has a lot of connotations behind it as well. So instantly I knew that would be the case. And I was lucky enough to have another bandmate that was also a woman, but it's still, you know, a 5-person band, 2 women in a very, very male dominated scene. It was just, you know, and we don't say it's the reason, but it is, you know, the Australian music scene is very much run by men as well. So not only do we have our own internal battles that we have to deal with, but the industry at large. So, you know, there's been artists that came up after us, like Camp Cope, that have, you know, gone out and been very vocal about the fact that lineups at music festivals in Australia are all men. I even have a T-shirt that says, "Why is the music industry run by Michael?" Like there's 3 Michaels that essentially run our whole industry here in Australia. And it's really infuriating. And the sad thing is, obviously, it's getting better, but it still isn't. I would not go back to the music industry still to this day, because it's still very, very hard.
Yeah. I mean, I full on had the experience. I used to write for a bunch of zines, and some of them like fairly well known, right? And like I would very often have people quoting my own reviews back to me, like just standing in a circle before the show started, and like, oh yeah, I'm really stoked about these friends. And just, you know, the circle wouldn't really include you, or you'd just be assumed to be the girlfriend of someone there. And
exactly. I will say though, we did have a lot of great bands though that were very, very supportive, and actually quite, especially in the post-punk scene, which was always surprising. But obviously it was few and far between.
I'm just going to pause to just offer the listeners a couple of books, which is a thing I do too much, maybe a little bit, but I think about DIY practices a lot, honestly. And there's 2 things here which I think make a really interesting crossover, because DIY is also a term in performance and theatre in the UK, and has been a bunch of the time that I was involved in theatre. I was actually really interested in the spaces between DIY music and theatre. So I put, there was a really well-known, when I lived in Leicester, DIY music venue in which I put on pay what you can experimental DIY performance. So I was just trying to break down those barriers because there's a lot of people there who just assumed that theatre was the thing that you go and sit in a velvet covered room to go and watch. And actually, like, there's really interesting experimental DIY theatre which crosses over comedy and music as well, and all that kind of stuff. And there's a really cool couple of books by Robert Daniels, who edited the collections. There are a bunch of writings from people who consider themselves DIY theatre makers. And they're really interesting, like people really getting to grips with what it means to be DIY, because part of it is going, we don't care about the systems you've built that call themselves an industry, right? We're over here being sort of independent and finding out new ways to make things. But often you're in that position because no one's giving you any money anyway. Like, no one's resourcing you. So you kind of have to build the resources. And it's a politics of necessity, and it's an aesthetics of necessity, which then sort of becomes a thing in and of itself. And that makes me also think of Brendan Coe's The Video Games Industry Does Not Exist book, which I started reading real recently. And I keep on reminding myself now that I want to call it the video games field, not the video games industry, because it's just more helpful. And it allows you to talk about the margins of practices, right? So the people making tiny bitsy games and releasing them on itch aren't like a part of the same industry structures, but they are part of the same practices. the same field. So I think that there's something really interesting about how we expand our definitions for what making is to include like not just the avant-garde, but also the DIY, right? And also like treasure your margins is a sentence from a book. I really don't remember I think it was investigating the pervasive media scene in Bristol. It was a study I read once, and they had this like this whole kind of building called the Pervasive Media Studio, in which academics, artists, technologists, game designers were all welcome. Like they just had free space, free tea and coffee, and it really, really brought the city of Bristol to life. And what they did is invited the margins in, the people who maybe didn't have resources, and then suddenly they were encountering one another. And I wonder if you have any sense of like how the scene in Brisbane changed Brisbane, actually. Like, do you feel like, because it will have done, it will have, like, even if it was just one or two people whose lives were sent in different directions, like,
definitely. Yeah, I definitely, like, I think even, you know, there's lots of great folks that I think, you know, they're either their music or they've left Brisbane and gone on to do great things. I think that's kind of that same mentality of the whole, all my friends are leaving Brisbane. Like they do leave Brisbane, but they always carry that with us. And it's been really interesting, obviously, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, a lot of people have returned home. And what we're actually seeing now because of that is it's obviously a gentrification. Brisbane also has this thing that they don't like keeping what's old. So the common thing in Brisbane is rather than renovating what's already there, they actually just knock everything down and build something new. Okay. So Brisbane as itself has an identity crisis. 1 minute it thinks it's Melbourne, 1 minute it thinks it's Sydney. And what's interesting now is that
for the listeners, what's a Melbourne and what's a Sydney? I think the Melbourne's the cool, hip, kind of trendy.
Yeah, some people say that Melbourne's New York, Sydney's LA.
Okay.
Some people say that because Sydney's quite businessy, corporate. Melbourne's very DIY, kind of grungy hipster. I don't know if that's true, but that's probably a good enough comparison.
Makes sense. So Brisbane is this sort of split between it doesn't know if it wants to be corporate or cool.
Yeah, but the interesting thing now that a lot of people of our generation are moving back, it's now reinventing itself again, which is also I'm quite excited about personally, because it's hopefully going to get to a point now that it finally like matures and settles into itself. Because in reality, Brisbane is also a great place to live because the weather is very, very nice. It's very close to the beach and all that type of stuff. So I get it, but it doesn't have the culture that it's kind of needed. It needs to figure out what its identity is. And I think that's also the metaphor for a lot of folks that leave Brisbane. Ironically, Brendan, who you referenced, he's in Brisbane, and he is a great addition to the games industry as well. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know where it's going to go next. I think it's one of those things I'm always keen to watch it, and every time I do go back, it does feel slightly better, a little bit less racist as well. I think that's another problem with Brisbane and Queensland is it does definitely have a lot of small town features as well, being very white. But luckily, during our last political election, and this also goes to speak to it wanting to change, is for the first time ever, Brisbane has had, I think, the most Greens election. So Greens are our like very progressive party. It's our like Greens obviously being for environment, but obviously they stand for a lot of other things. They had 3 or 4 actual people actually make it into parliament this time around, which has been across all of Australia. It's more than Australia has almost had. So we're actually seeing a real need for change in Brisbane, which is interesting and exciting. And because a lot of great people, Nick, for example, moved back to Brisbane recently as well. And he's actually going back to his roots around creating another music space and bringing people back together. So I have a lot of hope that these people will come back there. Unfortunately, I will not be one of them, but I look on with, you know, I do go back as much as I can, but yeah.
Why would you leave Melbourne? There's all that weather that you get there.
I love Melbourne so much.
Yeah. I'm just going to quickly draw a map in people's minds, hopefully, of the relationship between those three spaces in the map of Australia, because sometimes it helps to visualize things. So you all can probably sort of picture Australia. All the places we talking about are on the east coast, and sort of the bottom half of the east coast, that bottom sort of quadrant. And it's sort of in the very middle of Australia on the east coast, you have Brisbane, and then halfway down you have Sydney, and then maybe a shout out to Canberra, and then like at the bottom of that sort of quadrant, you've got Melbourne sort of tucked away into a little bit of a bay there.
And we've done the tour. We've done the tour and driven around the country multiple times. From Brisbane to Melbourne, it takes 18 hours to drive.
Right. And that's the thing, is that you look at the map and you go, oh no, maybe if I went to Melbourne, I could just go for a little cycle ride to Sydney, like go visit my friend who's in the cycling scene in Sydney. And like, no, you wouldn't.
No.
Like the space between these places is the thing about Australia, right? And that characterizes it.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you so much for sort of sharing that picture of your cool thing, this wonderful band Epithets, and also your journey through music. Before we get to how it has shaped your practice now in games, I wonder if you wanted to summarize maybe how you grew through your practice in bands and stuff, like the you that realized that you could play guitar when you were in like high school, like and the journey from that person to the person who made that sort of final recording in that barn in rural Australia.
I think the biggest thing for me has been a few things. It's been around confidence, and it's also been about whether or not I feel that I'm cool. I think the problem with playing music, and obviously the concept of being in a band, is inherently comes with the feeling of feeling cool. And for a long time, I put a lot more weight in that. And the thing that I like about playing in a band more than anything else is live performance. I hate recording. I absolutely loathe it. It's probably my least favorite thing in the world to do. And I kind of learned about myself around why that is. I think for me, the journey of playing in bands was actually more of a personal journey on therapy and learning about my own limitations and my own instant reactions to things, and learning how to not be an absolute nightmare to work with because of my inability to battle with ego versus what I want to do versus what I can do, and then also feeling confident in the music. I still feel very unconfident in the music that I've created recording wise, but it's something that I learned to deal with. And I think that's the biggest growth that I had, was around being not mature, because mature sounds very, very naff when you're in your 20s, but just learning how to navigate that insecurity, probably better than probably some of my peers at the time, because I think I realized I had to grow up pretty quickly in that male-dominated space as well. That was definitely the biggest challenge. I think, when I was younger, it was more of a fun thing. But then as soon as I got into the real world of having to actually put on shows and go and perform in front of friends and family, that was the whole thing where I was like, okay, I need to take this a bit more seriously and treat it like a skill. It is a skill set, obviously, but treat it like a skill that I can keep improving on every time. It was very, very difficult. It was still challenging, and I still remember really dark moments of feeling like I was unable to really even communicate why I hated what I was making. And it was so infuriating. Like it's funny thinking about being silenced at that time of my life when I was obviously very chatty and outgoing, but I just didn't have the framework to even describe what I was going through. And I just shut down and would become, a brat essentially. But yeah, I learned a lot. I learned absolutely a lot. It was a boot camp in emotional intelligence, working with other very diverse people as well. And it was very, very challenging. I also learned a lot about myself and my own insecurities. I think that's probably the most thing I learned about.
Yeah. And I imagine that being classically trained initially meant that you might have had a better ear for your violin playing than perhaps, people who might not have been classically trained, or at least are trained in other instruments and other sounds, right? So you almost might have felt kind of gaslit by that context.
It was awful. It was awful. Every time I heard myself, I thought I sounded terrible. I still I can hear it, and it makes me, because the problem with violin too, because you don't have frets, it's literal millimeters difference to make it in tune versus not in tune. And it's just like, every time I hear it, it's like I feel like I'm failing constantly.
And so this is actually a really useful segue, though, because it feels to me like the thing that you're interested in is the process. Like the recording makes you cringe because then that's recorded forever in time. But like the process of sort of improving or getting together and creating these things, and then performing live is recreating it in a different way, right? But that's not recorded for all posterity. It's there and it's in a moment and it can't be extricated from that moment. It's really interesting to me, therefore, that, despite, video games being a field which is screen-based and you might say recorded or a certain experience, the aspect of it which you've gone into is the people getting together trying to work out how to make things. And it's the people trying to perform every day in a way that is never captured in the final work itself. I don't know if you feel like you could take us through how you sort of found your way into games. Maybe I just put words in your mouth that don't exist, but
no, you definitely hit the nail on some of the things there for sure. I after my failed attempt at being a rock star, I definitely knew I needed to get out of Brisbane. That was obviously another thing. So I finished my degree. So I did game design, and then I left the band. That's why we obviously knew there was an end to this recording and everything like that. I moved down to Melbourne, and I used a lot of I don't even know how I learned this skill set, but I think it was just probably from the DIY world of hustling. Like, you've got who you have to speak to in the music industry, who the press is, who the key stakeholders are. That was something that I already knew. So I kind of took that approach, and I haven't really thought about that before until now, into basically figuring out and mapping out the game scene in Australia. I was like, I need to know who the right people are. So obviously used that skill set and just really reached out to a bunch of game developers. And it was during the era, I think, that the indie scene in Australia is probably our biggest scene at the moment, still with games. And so they're very inclusive and very welcoming of people, especially out of towners. So I reached out to a bunch of people, including Trent Custers, who is running League of Geeks to this day. And they were actually running Free Play at the time as well, which is a big independent games festival that is run in Melbourne. So he was on the board for that alongside Dan Golding. And I actually contacted them to talk about Free Play and the work that I was doing at Girl Geek at the time to see if we could collaborate. And after that, I actually just asked him, I was like, do you have any jobs going at League of Geeks? And this is another actually great, weird Brisbane connection. I did my university internship at Defiant Development in Brisbane. Rest in peace. Unfortunately, that studio has closed down, and was working with their producer, Kim Allam, who was awesome. And between me moving to Melbourne, she had reached out to Trent and told me that I was moving there. I didn't know this at the time. And she was like, you need to work with this person. She's awesome. And I had then reached out to Trent asking for a job. And he was like, did you talk to Kim? Kim just emailed me about you. And I was like, absolutely. Like, I hadn't spoken to Kim since I'd left. And it was just this weird serendipitous moment that I had someone from Brisbane vouch for me. And then obviously I was lucky enough to have a skill set that worked for League of Geeks. And it was just that's how I got my first job and ended up working there for obviously 8 years. But that kind of approach. But then the reason why I connected with the team, and also Trent, who obviously is one of my best friends to this day, is we had that shared DIY values. He I think actually had toured with bands in Japan. He'd he had very similar music scene. We had mutual friends because of music scenes as well. His was definitely more hardcore. Mine was more the sad music. But there was a lot of those mutual connections, and we established that relationship very, very quickly because of that as well. And then once again, being in an independent game studio that doesn't have a lot of money, that has a bunch of young 20-something kids trying to figure their lives out, that is directly correlated to what it was like being in a band in my early 20s. And because I was a bit older by the time I got into the games industry, older, quote unquote, like I was in my late 20s. But because of that experience, I felt I was much more equipped as a producer, to your point about just understanding how to get the best out of people, and also just learning from my own mistakes, right? And there was definitely a moment, I think in my second or third year of working, I was like, oh my goodness, I've learned this all from being in a band. Like, it was going back to those moments of being trapped in a van for 7 hours with these people that you don't want to talk to anymore because you're just so sick of listening to them, but they're also your best friends. And that sometimes happens in games when you're getting towards the end of making a game. You just hate each other. You just don't want to talk to each other. You're just like, we just need to focus on this thing. We need to make this thing. But then the next day it's all good again. And you have those moments of tension and frustration. And it's just about making sure that those points never get to a point that it's, you know, very low and very destructive. I think that's what music almost glorifies a lot. But games, obviously, I think trying to keep that a bit more stable was where I learned that and brought that across to my experience in the games industry. On top of that, also just
production processes have to be more stable because they take so much longer than it takes to write an album, though, right?
Oh
so
my
like
God, yes.
that's like it's the same like creative tensions, but I think one of the reasons producers are so valuable is that the stretching that process out over 2 to 3 years is just something which, you know, exacerbates and leaves a bunch of gaps that producers need to fill in order to support people and keep lifting people up, right? So sorry to interrupt you, but it was just to sing the praise.
Thank you. Someone's got to do it. No, it's great, and I love that part. Like, I always, you know, people talk about what tools you use as a producer or what, you know, what skill sets you need to have in regards to hard skills, and most of that's bullshit. That crux of what you described is like that almost social manipulation to a point of understanding how to make people work well with each other. I think that to me is more important than any other hard skill with producers. Is like, someone can sit back and go, this person's having a bad time because they're working with this person. How do we untangle that particular conflict? And it happens so often in the music industry all the time. Yeah, definitely.
And to just sort of fast forward, so you sort of, I mean, I need a better phrase than climb the ranks at League of Geeks, because it's, you know, it's a DIY context, the ranks aren't there, but you grew with the company, maybe is a better way of saying it, because the company was smaller, but then it got much, much bigger, and you were a really key part of sort of, I mean, scaling is one of the absolutely toughest things you can do, because you have a bunch of processes that work for 10 people, but they don't work for 200 people. And I'm not saying you've grown to 200, but like, so the process of scaling must have been a really, you know, a real crux of like the need for you in the company as like a steady hand.
Yeah, definitely. And to your point about growing with the company, that's 100% what happened. Like, there were moments, like I went from employee number 5 to a team of 70, and proud to say as well, we were a team of about 40% non-male as well, which was another, I think, a big part of that scaling process. But, you know, there were often situations where I'd say to Trent, I'm like, we need a production director. I think I can be that person, and these are the reasons why. And, you know, it was about him, obviously, one, taking a chance on me, but also understanding that I was capable of doing that. But often with every 2 or 3 years, there would be that growth and me having to figure out what I liked, what I didn't like. I wouldn't ever take an opportunity or take a role just because I thought it was going to be good for my CV. It was actually about how I would learn and how I would grow. And it's actually the reason why I ended up leaving as well, because I got to the point where I wasn't able to learn anymore, or I wasn't able to see that next rung, because I basically got to the point that I was so close to the founders. I was essentially part of that team anyway. So a lot of that, my own professional development and growth, was around, how do I grow with a team? What can I learn from this experience? Because like you said, scaling sucks and it's hard, but I always try to take it on that merit of, I'm going to learn something here. It's going to be really painful, but I'm going to learn something, and I'm also going to protect my team from that big, scary thing. And they were the kind of cornerstones to everything that I did during my time at League of Geeks, is how do I learn, how do I grow, but how do I also protect the team?
And you've also segued really naturally into the sort of the next step, which is that you sort of looking for other opportunities to grow. You moved to Kelper Interactive, where now, you know, you've chatted to me a little bit about your role. Your job is very much about sort of being a producer for lots of different companies, helping them be their own producers and sort of think about their production processes, right?
That's right. And it's a big challenge in Australia, because Brisbane's obviously a small city, but Australia is also a small country in regards to population and opportunities for game developers. And I love Australia. I love our games community, and I don't want to leave. So I knew that if I needed to take that next step and take a big leap for my own career, I would have to work remotely. And we were lucky enough at League of Geeks to get funding through the Kowloon Knights Fund. And that's how I actually got chatting to the CEO, Alexi, about what Kepler Interactive actually was about. And once again, I'm not going to take a job opportunity just because it is an opportunity. Everything that I do is, going into how do we actually make the games industry better? Mm-hmm. And I believe that Kepler Interactive are trying to do that with this more hands-off approach for everything, but also mainly production. So my role is really just respecting the limitations of the studios we work with and really being brought in when I'm needed, and then I just go back to my other work if I'm not needed. And it's been really exciting to learn that, but also for me personally, I just want to learn about how the hell money works in this industry. It's a big reason I took the role more than anything, because it's scary. It's really, really scary. It's very confusing. A lot of people don't tell and share how it works. And I'm really excited to sponge. I've already learned so much from a lot of smart people about how money moves in this industry. And I think it's critical for someone in my position to know that and also share that information. So that's also been another part of it as well. Because money seems to only go to certain people. And I was interested to know why.
Absolutely. And a really crucial part of this strange field of game making, which is half tech industry, half arts, right? And is trained in that confused way when people train in it, and is as a production model when you get to like the bit where money does exist as opposed to the fringes of the field. You find people who either don't know what they're investing in and that's why it works, or they do know what they're investing in, but the motivations for everyone else around them are just super unclear. Like all the indie companies at a certain scale trying to get like 500K to make the thing. I just like, why are you but like it's this thing, isn't it? Like recently that Sony paper was leaked with the budgets, and for a day it was the thing on Twitter, is everyone going, what I couldn't do with like 200 million, but actually it didn't seem a ton to me. Like, I mean, number one, yes, of course, it is a lot of money. Number two, films are made with a hell of a lot more money than that. So actually, it might look like kind of a bit of a bargain to someone from the film industry. Equally, you know that most people working probably aren't being paid enough or being treated super well for that money. So I'm sort of here going, wow, maybe my argument is they should have more money. But and then like I was in all this really complicated space, and it was really funny to me that some people were just really, because like Dico de Fabrique, a game like Potassione, a game like our next game, like really roughly, that's like a $3 to $4 million piece of work. And that's how much it takes to run a team of like 15-ish over 3.5 years and have them make it like fair wage. And it's not like I'm paying me a ton, because we have a flat wage structure. Everyone's paid the same. So it's not like we even have extortionate wages or anything. So in that context, like I just like, okay, times this by the number of people worked on it over the number of years. Like this actually just doesn't seem enough. And I don't think I would have thought that like 5 years ago, before I'd been in a lot more conversations, like where the money goes and who it goes to. It can feel a little uncool as people coming from the DIY industry, which is all about how you make with nothing. Right? But money is a part of the systems of power, exchange, and value that run our world. And understanding it means that you can understand one of those power structures. And I think it's really valuable.
Yeah, totally. And one thing that you just totally reminded me about that I was thinking about a little bit when I started at Kepler, because it was the first time, obviously, I've been learning more about this stuff. And the thing that I think about a lot, to kind of go full circle back to the music industry, was how back in the day when artists were signed for record labels, they would be signed on multiple record deals, right? Like Jeff Buckley was signed on a 3-record deal or something like that, assuming that the first album will be terrible, the second album will be better, and the third album will sell a lot. And obviously his first album ended up being really great, and unfortunately he passed away. But I think about that a lot in the sense of that's a purely creative way of thinking about how to fund things, right? And the thing that I still get frustrated about with games is this monkey barring, the fact that you have to fund the thing, and then the last 6 months of finishing the thing, you have to then look for the next thing. And it just never ends. It just never ends. And you're always judged on your last thing that you've done. And I often think about how games would work if it was formulated in a body of work rather than a one-off, and what that would look like, how much more room you could experiment with, what, you could fail much quicker on a first game and get to the second game faster, or whatever that looks like. And it's something that I think I have not thought about in about a year now, but I just was reminded of that, of like, looking at these other sectors and how they finance things. It scares me, obviously, seeing how close we're getting to music is now with regards to subscription models. That it makes me incredibly nervous. And it's obviously had huge impacts on the music industry, and it just I'm still very nervous about that stuff.
I'm just out here gonna say, just because you never know, unless you say, if anyone out there wants to give a 3-game deal to a studio, Diga de Fabric are just here. We're extremely good. we will take, I'll write a report. I have some academic training if that helps you. And all of
and that's totally true. Like studios like de Fabric, you deserve to be making games. Like all games deserve to be made, right? That no one should be judging that. And it's ironic, obviously, I'm now working for a publisher and blah, 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 blah. But I often talk about this a lot. And that's why I also enjoy Kepler, is because I can have these arguments with people and remind them about the kids on the ground. I think that's also an important part of always sticking to this DIY roots as well, is that I really, really hope that I never become, and I would love to fast forward to 10 years from now, is like, do I become that person that loses this level of connection with reality, really? Like, because up there, that's not real. Like up in the millions and millions and millions and billions of dollars, that's not real. That's like, the 1%, right? So
I think I'm stoked that you're out there in that part of the field, the industry. Sorry, Brendan. I'll get it right. But like, thinking about funding is just a really crucial thing. Like, I think is it Michael Sandel, a philosopher, who said that like Harvard should be a lottery system, because he wrote this book called The Tyranny of Merit, right? And I would love for someone to give me $1 million and for me to produce a funding system for a particular marginalized group, maybe like, say, people of color in the UK, okay? And the only application is to just basically show that you're not just going to go spend it on ice cream. But like, I don't know why I went with ice cream. I don't know. Maybe I wanted ice cream.
That's very cute. It's very wholesome.
But I would really love someone to give me enough money to experiment with a lottery system for funding, because like, there are points where I've been looking at recruitment, and any 100 of these people would do an incredible job. And like, the tyranny of merit is that merit is a currency which is already drawn along lines of privilege, right? And all of that's to say, I'm stoked that you're out there being in the funding bit. I'm going to begin to wrap us up now. But just thank you so much for sharing like your journey through sort of DIY music into games with us. I wonder if there's something you would like to offer the listening audience for their own practices, for how they make things, like from your experience, from your journey. Is there like a lesson or like anything in like that kind of terms?
I think definitely for me, and obviously I feel like music's an obvious one, but I think there is something to be said about where you can pull your inspirations from. And ironically, I found it very difficult to find a topic for today because I work so much, and it is sometimes hard to kind of think about that. Like I struggled with even thinking about where has my inspiration come from. And it was really almost sad when I realized that I'd forgotten about it. And I think it's important to kind of reflect on those moments, because it's so easy to get spun up in your day-to-day life. And you think that what you are today is because of what you learned this year. And, we all learn this through therapy, that things come from your childhood and from your earlier formative years. I think thinking about that and reflecting on that is good and bad. It's difficult, but it's important to kind of understand why in yourself that you are the way you are today. So
absolutely. Reflection is an essential part of practice, which I think, like, I came up through doing like 50 projects a year in DIY theatre, right? And in that context, every single time you finish something, you can reflect on it and you learn pretty quickly. And I do feel sorry for people who never do anything other than games and like get stuck into 3-year cycles and stuff, or things. Maybe something gets made for a year and then gets sort of shelved. Like it makes the process of reflection super hard to find. And so I think that's an incredible lesson to offer people who make games. If you don't currently have means of reflection in your processes, then find ways to build them in to your own practice, whether that's just keeping a journal and or at the end of every month, just going, these are the things I learned and these are things I wouldn't do again. And these are things I would. Like you can find spaces in your own practice, even if the structures you're working in don't offer them.
Well said.
Right. So, okay, we are wrapping up now. But you were right. Before we started recording, you were like, Hannah, I think we could talk for a really long time. And we have this is going to be a long episode, but I've managed to keep us just under the hour.
I'm sorry.
No, it's only a measure of how excellent you are, Lisy. Finally, this is your opportunity to promote anything and share any socials that we should follow you or the things that you're connected to on. So what would you like to promote?
I definitely would like to promote what you said before as well, the Girl Geek Academy report. It's a very important report. If anyone wants to talk to me about how we did it or how they could implement it in their own country or region, I would love to talk about that. Other than that, don't even know about Twitter anymore. LisyKane.com is where you can best reach me. I think Blue Sky, I'm on there now. Lisy.bluesky.
Hey, follow me. I got an account yesterday.
Yeah.
Follow me on Blue Sky.
That's where I talk about all my nonsense and games. I'm pretty public about my thoughts and feelings, so I'm pretty reachable.
Yeah, awesome. And we'll make sure that those links are also in the liner notes for people listening to the podcast. So all that remains is for me to say thank you so much for sharing this sort of journey through your life. It's really wonderful. And I just really enjoyed finding out that we're both latent emos at heart.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of One Cool Thing from Digue de Fabrique. As usual, leave a rating or review where you can. It really matters to us. So if you enjoyed your time here, then please do so to say thank you. And in case you missed it, we're super delighted to say that our next major game project is now announced. Coming out in 2023, Saltsea Chronicles is a flooded world, brand new story-driven adventure game where you investigate a mystery as a ship's whole crew. It really is a step up for the studio in storytelling ambition from our last title, Mutazione, but is still just as beautifully designed and animated, and with what I honestly believe is some world-class writing. Wishlist Saltsea Chronicles on Steam right now and head to saltseachronicles.com to find out more. I'll be back soon with a new episode speaking with another cool thinker and maker in the field of video games. And in the meantime, check out Digue de Fabrique on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. We added a TikTok. I am not running it as you would expect. You can find us in all those places as Gute Fabrik. That's Gutefabrik. This podcast was produced, edited, and sound designed by Tom Wally. Additional production and research by Unamin Kavanagh, who, by the way, runs our TikTok very well. Our theme music is by Nick Ellis, whose music you can find under the name 10B on Bandcamp. That's Tenby. Stay thoughtful, friends. Take care. Goodbye.